So today I'm here with the very lovely Lisa Gill. Hi, Lisa, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your time today. First of all, it's really lovely to speak to you. We've not spoken in a really long time.
Yeah, super nice.
So it's really good to speak to you. Lisa Gill is a coach and trainer at Tough Leadership Training. She's also host of the Leadermorphosis podcast. She's based in Barcelona. We've just been having a nice chit chat about co-working spaces in different parts of the world, which is very cool. But today we're talking all about liberating structures. You are probably a little bit more of an expert on liberating structures than I am, but one of the things I think that we both like about it is that it's just a very kind of open sourced idea and open source model. And I will put the link to the website that I use. It's got in the show notes below. It's got a really great menu of all the different liberating structures, and what I like about them is that you can either as a founder, as a leader, as a team member, or as a coach or a consultant facilitator, you can just sort of dip in to them. But basically it's like different. Okay, maybe I'll ask you, what's your, how would you describe what liberating structures are?
Yeah, it's a good question. The way I like to describe it is so Keith McCandless and Henry Littmanovich, who kind of curated them and wrote the book and created the website, they talk about how we use these conventional microstructures that we don't even realize we're using, things like a presentation or a brainstorm, when we're having meetings or discussions. And all of these structures that we are used to using tend to be either kind of limited in terms of the number of people that shape the outcome or influence the outcome, or the number of people who actually participate actively in them. For example, in a presentation, it's someone broadcasting and the others listening, right? Or they're sort of more scattered or unstructured, like a brainstorm, where at the end it's like, okay, now what? Who's responsible for what, or what's the next step? So liberating structures are liberating in the sense that many more people can be involved and included in participating in shaping the outcome of the gathering or the discussion, but they're structured at the same time. So there's a very specific, clear structure on timings of things, for example, number of participants in groups, sequence of steps, and that's to deliberately make them more purposeful and more kind of clear, so that you can help get to an outcome quite quickly, oftentimes, in a way that includes many more people.
So one of the ways, I love your description, like one of the things that I kind of tend to, the way I sort of relate to liberating structures is that they are sort of loads. I think there's about 33, is that right at the moment?
Yes, and then there's some others in development, but those are the main ones.
So they're basically like different frameworks. For me, how I think of them is they're frameworks to, to state the obvious, to kind of liberate ideas and conversations in your business. For me, it's just about having a different kind of a conversation, like getting something different, because I think a lot of times we're used to certain ways of doing things, certain types of conversations, certain processes, certain power structures even. But sometimes we need to do something differently just to get that different result. And I think a lot of businesses are really craving a slightly different result. I don't want to, like, this is not a tutorial video, but like I said before, like one of the things that I love about liberating structures is that there is just this website with a menu, and it's just really clear, like this is what it can do, this is how you do it, this is how you can sort of change it up, this is what to watch out for, so you can just dip into it. But I would love to ask you what your favorite liberating structures are, like how, just if you could just give them basics of like your favorites, how you use them, what sort of results that you've had, like why you like them.
Yeah, well, one of my favorites is one that you and I were talking about just before we recorded, which is called Triz. And it speaks exactly to what you just talked about, which is that sometimes we get stuck in like a pattern of thinking or a way of talking about things that limits what's possible, or limits, you know, our creative thinking. And Triz is a really great one because it's sort of designed and quite playful. I always find, like, you know, you can really approach it in a playful and fun way of, you know, what if we were designing for the outcome we don't want, what would our to-do list look like? So if you're a bunch of leaders, for example, and, you know, you're trying to improve your, I don't know, leadership culture or whatever, then you might use Triz as a way of looking at, you know, if we wanted to create a leadership culture that was completely toxic and disempowering, what would our to-do list look like? And then you get people to kind of reflect and talk to each other and go bold and big with it, you know, like, well, we would, you know, not listen to people and talk over them in meetings, or we would, you know, write all of our documents in Klingon so no one can understand them, or, you know, whatever. And then you have a look at these things and assess kind of honestly, are there any of these things that we're doing currently that you know, that we need to stop doing? And then people sort of, it becomes more serious and people realize, well, okay, you know, we don't do that, but actually we could definitely be more involving in meetings, or sometimes we have a tendency to do this and this. So it sort of creates this container for people to really like interrogate all the ways in which we're doing things that are kind of going against what we want, so that we can then kind of clear them to make space for what we do want. So that's one of my favorites. And then the other one that I go to a lot is, there's sort of two versions. One is Troika Consulting and one is Wise Crowds. And they both have sort of similar principles, which is that you have someone who brings like a challenge or an issue, and you use the wisdom of the group to help them think of ways to approach it. And why I like it as well is because it includes a step where after some clarifying questions, the person who is bringing the challenge turns their chair around, or if you're in Zoom, you can turn your camera off, put yourself on mute, and then the group sort of discuss, you know, what might I do, or what would be useful for this person. So it helps you kind of listen in a more deep way, I find. So I've worked with groups who where you have, you know, a group of people from the same company and they get lots of different input on people's challenges. And I've worked with groups that are people from completely different backgrounds and companies and get really valuable input on their challenges as well. So it works in so many different contexts, and people come away with, oh, you know, I hadn't thought of that question before, or that's a really great idea that I hadn't even considered I could do. So it's really fun to watch.
I think one of the nuggets of that, because I think remind me to ask you, by the way, where some of, I don't know if you know where the names of these came from, like Triz and Troika Consulting, but anyway, the Troika Consulting, it's kind of like a familiar concept, really, that, you know, someone has a challenge and you go into a group and, you know, and you get sort of exclusive feedback about that one challenge, like wisdom of the crowd kind of idea. I think the real sort of magic in this particular liberating structure is then that person sort of effectively kind of stepping out and being able to listen, because not only does that change how you're going to listen, because you're kind of like spying almost, you're kind of like, you're sort of listening in secret, so there's less sort of pressure, I guess, to respond, there's less of a spotlight on you. But then to flip that round, like what is going to be said and like what sort of freedoms are sort of given when the person isn't there, like what is said that might not be said directly to that person is like, yeah, like definitely very liberating. I'd like to maybe come back, because you also mentioned the wise crowds structure, but whilst I'm kind of on this subject, what are your thoughts around the kind of psychological safety of these kind of structures? Because that ultimately can be a barrier to liberating ideas in your business at all. And the example that we've just talked about, like, how important is psychological safety? How do liberating structures provide that kind of safety? And maybe, like, what do you do as a coach and facilitator to help bring about that sense of, this is a safe space. We want to open up to things that might not be said normally, but we also don't want a situation, obviously, where people are, feel psychologically unsafe in any way. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's such a good question. I think for me, liberating structures are so helpful in creating safety, especially at the start of a session that I'm, leading with a group of people. And at the end, like, if nothing else, I often use them as bookends. And to give an example, I'm an introvert. So for me, if someone says, so, let's just popcorn style share, what are you coming in with, like a check-in, or what are your questions today, or what do you think we should talk about? That's terrifying for me. I won't speak up. So liberating structures, like a really simple one, like 1, 2, 4, all, is designed to create safety, because you have 1 minute where you have people individually reflect on something in silence. Then you put them in pairs, or they choose a partner, and they talk for 2 minutes in their pair about the same thing they just reflected on. Could be a question, could be a check-in, could be, reflecting on something they've just heard, like a presentation or whatever. Then they join with another pair, and for 4 minutes, discuss, notice differences, similarities. And then the final stage, you come together as a group and you hear kind of a highlight from each of the groups. So it creates safety. And also, within 15 minutes, everyone has spoken, everyone is, actively engaged, but it creates that little bit more safety, because you're starting by yourself and then with just one other person, and then it's sort of going up and up. And there's lots of liberating structures that do that. There's another one called impromptu networking, which is a really good way to get people started, where you have them, rotate around different pairs and share something like, what's one thing I want to get out of the session today? What's one thing I want to give to it? And, what's a big question I'm bringing? And then there are ones like Spiral Journal, which is one of the ones in development, which is a little bit more reflective and almost like mindful or meditative, which is often also a really great way of creating safety and getting people to do something a bit outside their comfort zone. And then again, kind of discussing that with a pair, and then in a 4, and then, sharing as a group. So that for me creates safety. And I want to add a caveat as well, which is that I know there's a very active liberating structures community. I've been to one of the global gatherings in Seattle a few years ago, and there's a very active Slack community. And one of the things they've been wrestling with is what are some of the ways in which the liberating structures might not be so psychologically safe, for example, for certain types of people. So they are designed from complexity thinking, but they're also designed by 2 white men, for example. So there's a group of people of color who are exploring, what are the additional things that you might want to do or say to create that level of safety, because it's sort of assumed that, in a short space of time, for example, people feel safe enough to kind of very quickly share something. And if there are power dynamics in a group, that may not be the case. Or if there are people with accessibility needs, then you obviously need to take that into consideration. So, I just want to say that they're not like 100% guaranteed psychologically safe, but I think that the way they're designed certainly helps create that safety and kind of build it in, because it's also people stepping into something, a framework, rather than asking them to do something that might be interpersonally kind of risky.
Yeah, that's a really great point, and I'm very, very grateful for you raising that. I think where I was kind of coming from with that question is just, I think it's a great first step in terms of creating psychological safety, that these are like processes, conversations, tools that do feel a little bit more conscious. So you have that structure, and that in itself, I think, is a great first step into just kind of considering the different people in the room, their needs, the desire to liberate a conversation and to liberate ideas, but also the very real and genuine barriers to that happening for some people, whether it's past experiences or power dynamics. Or I think you made a great point when you said, yeah, I'm an introvert. And so, 1, 2, 4 all is a really useful structure for you, because you get 1 minute at the start to just think about it for yourself quietly.
Yeah.
You don't have to try and do that thinking whilst also like staying in the room. But then it's sort of like you're kind of eased in, because then you get to share that with just one other person, which is almost like, okay, well, let's kind of check this out, like maybe practice verbalizing it in a different way or whatever. And then it grows, and then it grows. The other thing about that, you said, yeah, because then in 15 minutes, everyone has spoken. I just wanted to kind of really highlight that the structure kind of says, yeah, you have, it's not just 1, 2, 4 all in terms of the people, it's actually timings as well. So it's not a process that can then just become really long and drawn out. And to have that time structure to it, I think it can feel a bit peculiar for some people at first, like, yeah, we're going to talk, and it's, you literally have 1 minute to do this, or then, okay, have this conversation, you've got 2 minutes. So I think it can feel peculiar, but I think once people get used to it, it can be really liberating to have. And it's that it's kind of like the polarity, right, of sort of liberating by creating a boundary, by creating a structure. It's it's an interesting one.
Yeah, and I do sometimes say something about that, when people are experiencing liberating structures for the first time, where I'll say, this is how it's going to be, and that it's going to feel fast. So that might feel strange at first. So don't worry, because it will, you'll get more and more used to it. And also, if more time is needed, you can always do another round of 1, 2, 4 all. Or, as Keith and Henry say, you can always play with the constraints. So you could change the timings, and then it's just about being mindful. What are the trade-offs if you do that?
Yeah. And that's the whole point, right? Is like, let's sort of be more conscious, be more mindful about bringing people together. And you mentioned different groups, whether it's accessibility issues, whether it's people of color, whether it's an introvert, a more reflective, quieter person, whether it's neurodiversity. Like there's so many types of people that I think many leaders and founders really want to be able to include and consider. But I think that often, like, the pace of business and cultures as they tend to form can be a very real barrier to doing that. So it does kind of mean, okay, yeah, maybe we just have to slow down. Maybe we just have to do something differently. We just have to reconsider here. But here's a set of tools that means we know how to do that. We're not just saying, like, slow down. We're not. It's not just a message of, well, just be more inclusive. I think a lot of people really want to be able to do that, but the question around how is can be quite difficult.
Yeah, exactly. I think I've heard so many senior leaders or founders say to me, whenever we have meetings, I ask people what they think, I ask for input, and it's just silence, especially in Zoom. I think that real, sterile vacuum black hole silence.
Yeah.
And it's because they're just not aware that there's a way of doing that that's more likely to have people step in and say something. So it's not that people don't have anything to say or don't want to say anything.
Yeah.
It's just that if you say to an open room, what do you think? That's very scary.
Yeah.
So
also, I think in some cultures, like the opposite can happen, and like sometimes you get sort of too many voices. I think there are some cultures that are just very extrovert in nature.
yes.
And so actually that can also be a barrier, because you want to sort of find that middle ground where no one person is overpowered, or you're not just kind of layering ideas on ideas on ideas, because so many people want to kind of contribute, and you have a lot of very strong characters. So yeah, I love it for all those reasons as well. Just sort of side note, do you know where some of these names come from? Like Triz is one of my favorites. That's the one that you mentioned right at the start. It's sort of basically, it's kind of like reversing what you're doing, so you're kind of like designing for failure in a really fun way, and I've seen you facilitate this. It was the first time I'd experienced Triz, actually, was when you facilitated that. Must be about 6 years ago now that happened. But the group loved it. Like it went down so well. And oh yeah, another side note, Triz kind of reminds me of another question that I really love, which is just, what are we not saying? And I don't know where, where or how that sort of appears specifically in Liberating Structures, but it's just another great way of kind of accessing information that we might not normally access. But yeah, Triz, do you know where these names have come from? Triz, Troika Consulting?
Yeah, I mean, they come from different places. Many of these structures people will be familiar with, perhaps, because Keith and Henry have sort of curated them from different places. So Triz, I believe, is like a Russian, and it comes from Russian engineering. I think it stands for something that I can't pronounce at all. And then others come from different things. There's a really beautiful one called Future Present that I really like, that comes from Joanna Macy's work. And a lot of them are trying to describe what they are. 1, 2, 4, all does what it says on the tin,
That's an easy one.
So they come from different places. A lot come from like the world of complexity thinking.
I figured there must be a reason. And Triz, when you go onto the website, Triz it's all capitalized letters. So, but I've never, do you happen to know if there's a space on the website? Like I've never found. I would love to see a description of where all the names came from. Do you know if that exists?
I don't think there's a page, but I think if not I'm sure it does say something on the web page when you go into Triz on the menu, or if not, perhaps in the book, because the book is quite a thick book, and it's quite a nice context that it provides of the principles that underpin liberating structures.
Yeah, okay.
And then there's also the app, which I love, and fun little thing when you download the app, the actual icon of the app is Lisa, because it's Liberating Structures app. So people have pointed that out to me. Yeah, so that's quite fun.
So for everyone listening or watching called Lisa, like
it's made for us.
Real famous. Nice. I didn't know there was an app. That's a nice.
It's free, and it's great because you can sort by how much time have you got. You can sort by the purpose. You can sort by different criteria, and then it's just there. I use it a lot because if I'm like, okay, I spontaneously want to use a liberating structure, which one do I want? I just want to remind myself of the instructions or the sequence of steps. So that's really handy. And there's also like
refresh, tap into it.
There's also on the website they have a matchmaker tool, and sometimes I've done it with groups where you print that out and you have them build their own string of liberating structures. That's what it's called when you kind of combine them based on looking at the purposes of each of the structures and then choosing a sequence of purposes that feels relevant to that particular reason why they're getting together, and then as a group sifting through and agreeing on a string that makes sense based on the time that you have. So there's so many different ways to use them. That's what's really fun about them.
Yeah, love it. You were going to mention right at the start, you said one of your favorites was Wise Crowds. Tell us about Wise Crowds.
So Wise Crowds is basically the same setup as Troika Consulting. The main difference is that Troika Consulting is in threes and you rotate around each person. So let's say it's you, me, and a third person. Maybe I bring a challenge first, I talk about it, and the other two of you, are like my consultants and you give me some input. In Wise Crowds, it's the same thing, but it could be me bringing the challenge and then a group of 6 or 7, or even like a whole room of people. So it becomes more challenging, obviously, the bigger the group size. But it means that you can, again, I often kind of split out groups. So I might say like who has a challenge they'd like some input on, and then those people all split off into different groups and people cluster around them. And then they go through the sequence of steps, which is always like present your challenge, a round of clarifying questions, then a discussion about, what their recommendations might be with the person, as we talked about before, kind of turning around in their chair or putting themselves on mute or turning the camera off on Zoom, and then a final kind of, what the person took away from it. And again, both Wise Crowds and Troika Consulting are, I think it's like the sequence of timing totals like 12 minutes, certainly 15 minutes or less. And you wouldn't think that you could get a meaningful, contribution to your challenge from a group, but people are amazed time and time again that, wow, in like 15 minutes or less, I got really helpful, like, poignant input on my challenge from a group of people that, don't share the same role as me or background or whatever. I would not have believed that was possible.
Yeah, I find that obviously like part of my background is the holacracy framework and the holacracy community, and I find that with just in holacracy it's called the tactical meeting process. I use that process a lot, like even nothing to do with holacracy, just like the question, what do you need, and that structure of having everyone be able to kind of build the agenda like in the meeting. It's not just sort of one person like chairing a meeting. It's amazing how quickly that something like that can have such a dramatic impact on not just on the group, and actually not just on the outcomes, but also the relationships, like and sort of the interpersonal space, with which, let's be honest, always impacts a group, like whether you take time to kind of explore that or not, like it's always going to impact. How do you find that liberating structures can also impact the interpersonal sort of relational space for a group of people?
Yeah, I love that question. I mean, something like Troika Consulting or Wise Crowds, people always say, don't they, that human beings love to be asked for help or advice, that it makes us feel really, special or important or valued. So when people go through a Wise Crowds or a Troika Consulting, you see that, how people really appreciate and feel connected because people have taken the time to listen and ask questions and then share thoughts on a challenge. So that person is really kind of honored, in that space. Or something like Triz, where you're asking people to kind of playfully but quite boldly challenge some of the norms and assumptions in a way that deepens relationships, and like you said, so many of the liberating structures are designed to get us talking about the things that we don't talk about. And again, that is sort of risky. There's some really interesting research by a guy called Michael Y. Lee about how to foster positive interpersonal dynamics. And he said the two main principles that really help are safe spaces and interaction scripts. So safe spaces just means something away from our day-to-day work, could be like a specific meeting or space or physical space. And then interaction scripts, when he told me that, I was like, oh, like liberating structures. Because, if I give you a sentence to complete or a sequence of steps, it makes it so much easier to talk about things that are difficult to talk about because I've got something to hang on to. And we're all doing the same thing, or we're all following the same sort of script. So I think that allows people to go much deeper than they think. I know sometimes when I've planned to do tris with groups, some people have said, "Ooh, that might be a bit risky. That might open up a can of worms." And I'm like, just trust it, because you'll be surprised that if you relate to people's potential, they'll dive into it and they'll surface things that are difficult to talk about in a way that's kind of respectful and constructive. And I'm always positively surprised when I kind of, dare to do it without kind of pandering to a group. It goes deep fast, I think.
Yeah, I often facilitate like purely relational spaces for a group. And I don't know, you can tell me if there's a liberating structure that sort of matches this. It's something that again, sort of taking from holacracy, the check-in round, which is certainly not exclusive to holacracy by any means, but I've just sort of created a process that I use regularly, where people are first of all able to check in, which is a relatively short process, but then we use the same structure but just like really open it up and give people space to just talk about something, and we kind of set a bit of a theme or a bit of a question or something. And when I find when I create that kind of a space where there's no crosstalk, like there's no interactions, you're not going to be sort of judged or quizzed or you're not starting a conversation, you're just able to speak into the space, and then you have that time, and then it's the next person can go and just speak into the space. I am, like, without fail, when I do this, amazed at the depth that people get to. And again, there's something about the structure that kind of just makes it inherently safe. And I acknowledge what you say, like, is it ever like truly 100% safe? And so you have to sort of keep that awareness, but the level of depth that you can get to with some of these structures, like, and I love smooshing around in that deep space, so I love it. But it can have such an impact on a group as well.
Yeah, I just want to share a really quick story about that, which is a mutual colleague of ours, Susan Basterfield, and I were doing a workshop in Nepal a few years ago. And we did a liberating structure called Mad Tea, which is where you have two circles of people, like concentric circles, and you have a list of prompts that are sort of like a bit esoteric, a bit strange, a bit abstract. And you have people talk, complete a sentence, like something that gives me energy is da da da, whatever. And they just talk, and then the other person talks. They don't comment on it or anything. And when we were about to do it, we realized that many people didn't speak the same language. So there were people speaking, Cantonese, English. And we were like, how is this going to work? But we were like, well, let's try it. And actually it worked beautifully, because oftentimes people couldn't understand what the person was saying, but they somehow still picked up the essence of it. They gave them the space, and it became even more profound. It was wonderful.
Wow, that is extraordinary.
Yeah.
I would never imagine that sort of structure would work across a multilingual group. That is extraordinary.
Yeah, it was really
Oh,
cool.
what a beautiful note to kind of wrap up on. I wanted to ask you before we kind of close off, is there anything else, like, is there anything that I've not asked you, or is there anything else that you wanted to say or share just about how you use liberating structures, or even not just liberating structures, but how you support a process of liberating a different kind of conversation or a different kind of idea or outcome in a group?
Yeah, maybe two things I'll share briefly in closing are, the first is when I interviewed Keith and Henry for my podcast, they said this great phrase, which is, a lot of people who are interested in new ways of working, teal organizations, holacracy, whatever. Keith and Henry were saying that liberating structures is a way of doing that. It's like acting into a new way of organizing, is how they put it. So at like a micro level, at the habit level, you know, it's something that you can very quickly start to do in an organization, without getting loads of permission or changing structures and processes radically. You know, you can just start using a liberating structure in your meetings, for example, and it will shift things already.
Start
And
by
then
starting is
exactly,
something I often say.
yeah, and it doesn't
Yeah.
matter which one you pick, you know, just pick
Yeah.
one, it will be better. And I have a blog called What Are Liberating Structures? It's one of the first things that comes up on Google when you Google liberating structures. And I have, like, you know, all of the links to the app, the website, you know, the book, a couple that you might want to start with. So if anyone's thinking of diving in, then that might be a good place to start.
Nice. Lisa, I have loved this conversation.
Me too.
It's definitely covered everything that kind of I imagined it might cover, but then it's gone further as well into just how valuable some of these tools and processes can be. And I love to end it on the two notes of just how powerful it was, even in a group that couldn't understand each other, but then also how accessible these structures are. It's definitely one of the reasons that I love them, is that it just gives you full permission to just start by starting and just sort of dive in and just change the nature of the conversation in your group, in your community, in your business, and then just kind of like stand back and enjoy like the power of that, and the sort of the liberation of that, and the new ideas. So this has been awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And yeah, hopefully we'll talk to you again sometime.
Thank you.